This is Justine Sparrgrove, going through Chapter 1, Mental Health and Mental Illness for Health Promotions. All right. Concepts of mental health and mental illness are culturally defined by an individual's culture. A culture and religious beliefs can influence how a society views and treats mental health and mental illness. Evil spirits or supernatural or magical powers may have been entered into the body. Some people believe in that. Some people believe that a cure, in quotes here, could include exorcism, beatings, starvation, torturous means to purge the body of unwanted forces. And note that as a result, there are multiple definitions of mental health and mental illness. So in the new book, page 3, there are different parts of Maslow's hierarchy. There's physiological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. And they're all related to one another. Note the characteristics that Maslow believes self-actualized individuals possess: an appropriate perception of reality, the ability to accept oneself, others, and human nature, the ability to manifest spontaneity, the capacity for focus, concentration on problem solving, a need for detachment and desire for privacy, independence, autonomy, and resistance to enculturation, an intensity of emotional reaction, a frequency of peak, experience that validate the worthwhileness, richness, and beauty of life, an identification with humankind, the ability to achieve satisfactory interpersonal relationships, a democratic character, structure, and strong sense of ethics, creativeness, and a degree of non-conformance. Mental health is defined as the successful adaptation to stressors from the internal or external environment, evidenced by thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are age-appropriate and congruent with local and cultural norms. The definition here will be used throughout the rest of our Learning Plan 5. Mental illness is defined as maladaptive responses to the stressors from the internal or external environment, evidenced by thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are incongruent with the local and cultural norms and interfere with the individual's social, occupational, or physical functioning. Again, this is a definition that we'll use throughout this learning plan or course. Cultural elements associated with individuals' perception of mental illness make a universal concept of mental illness difficult to define. So two of these elements are defined by Horowitz as incomprehensibility and cultural relativity. So incomprehensibility is the inability of the general population to understand the motivation behind the behavior, and cultural relativity is the normality of behavior is determined by the culture. So I want you to think about both of these and actually how they might influence attitudes towards mental illnesses. Just stop and think about that for a minute. So cultural relativity, so normality of behavior is determined by the culture. So what I think is normal may not necessarily be what is considered normal, even someplace, say, West Coast or East Coast. Something that I figure is normal, maybe farmers waving to people. We're very friendly around here. We think that's normal, but people not from the Midwest are like, wow, that's different. So even something as simple as that can make a difference. But really think about it with mental illness, how different things are considered normal for them, but may not be normal from how we look at it. Physical and psychological responses to stress. Hans Seeley defines stress as the state of manifested by a specific syndrome, which consists of all the non-specifically induced changes within a biologic system. So this syndrome has come to be known as the fight or flight syndrome. We are very knowledgeable about fight or flight. We've talked about it over and over again. So it's when we run away from that bear, everything kind of revs up. So there's 3 distinct stages for Seeley's general adaptation syndrome. It's alarm reaction stage, stage of resistance, and then stage of exhaustion. Stage of resistance, using the physiological response of the first stage, the person attempts to adapt to the stressor. If the adaptation occurs, the third stage is prevented or delayed. The alarm stage, let's start there. Alarm reaction stage is the fight or flight syndrome response are initiated, and then the stage of resistance is using the physiological response of the first stage. And if the person attempts to adapt to the stressor, if the adaptation occurs, the third stage is prevented or delayed, and physiological symptoms may disappear. In the third stage, a stage of exhaustion, the adaptive energy is depleted, and diseases of adaptation may ensue. And then the biological responses associated with fight or flight can include immediate responses like the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine, increased respiration rate, increased heart rate, all those fun things that we've reviewed over and over again. And sustained responses like increased glucogenesis, increased basal metabolic rate, and decrease in secretion of sex hormones and things can actually happen. All right, so let's check your understanding real quick. A 25-year-old man barely avoids a motor vehicle accident. His heart is pounding, his palms are sweaty, and his respirations are increased. This is an example of which stage of the general adaptation syndrome: the alarm reaction stage, the stage of resistance, the stage of exhaustion, or the stage of biological stress. The correct answer here was A. The physiological response of the fight or flight syndrome are initiated in an alarm reaction stage of the general adaptation syndrome. These physiological responses generally include an increased heart rate and respirations, and may include other symptoms such as headache, sweaty palms, and a sensation of dizziness. All right, biological responses associated with fight or flight syndrome. There's the immediate response and then the sustained response. The immediate response is a stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, which usually results in the dilation of the pupils, dilation of the bronchioles, and increased respiration rate. So that way we have enough oxygen to feed our body as we're running away from that bear. Increased force of cardiac contraction, which causes an increased cardiac output, heart rate, and blood pressure. Again, those will all help sustain our body as we're running away from the bear. Increased gastric motility and secretions, increased secretion from the sweat glands, and then other responses. And then obviously the sustained response is holding that. All right, the sustained response occurs after prolonged periods of stress. The pituitary gland releases a number of hormones that can cause a range of effects, which include increased glucogenesis and retention of sodium and water, or ACTH, decreased immune inflammatory responses, ACTH, fluid retention, vasopressin, increased blood pressure, again, vasopressin, increase the basal metabolic rate, which is thyrotropic hormone that actually affects that. Anxiety and grief is a psychological response to stress. There are a variety of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors associated with these responses, and they may vary depending on the individual. Adaptation is determined by the degree of which these thoughts, feelings, and behaviors interfere with an individual's level of functioning. Again, anxiety. So it's a vague nature of associated feelings. The feelings of anxiety are very common in society, and nearly everyone feels anxiety in some way, shape, or form. There are varying levels of anxiety, and anxiety can become problematic when an individual is unable to prevent it from interfering with everyday life. So, such as maybe going to the supermarket to buy things or driving someplace, using a public bathroom. There's multitudes and varying degrees of anxiety that can prevent us from doing things. Pavlov's 4 levels of anxiety and their effects on the individual. So the mild anxiety prepares people for action. It sharpens the senses, increases motivation for productivity, increases the perceptual field, and results in heightened awareness of the environment. Learning is enhanced here, and the individual is able to function at his or her optimal level. Then there's moderate anxiety. Extent of the perceptual field diminishes. Individual becomes less alert to the events occurring within the environment. Attention span and ability to concentrate decrease, and assistance with problem solving may be required. An increase in muscular tension and restlessness happen here. Severe anxiety, perceptual field diminishes greatly. Concentration centers on one particular detail only, or on many extraneous details. Attention span is extremely limited. The individual has much difficulty completing even the simplest tasks. Physical symptoms may include the headache, palpitations, and insomnia. Emotional symptoms may include confusion, dread, and horror. And virtually all overt behavior is aimed at relieving that anxiety. And there's the panic anxiety, where the individual is unable to focus on even one detail within the environment. Misperceptions are common, and a loss of contact with reality actually may occur. Hallucinations or delusions may be present. Behavior may be characterized by wild and desperate actions or extreme withdrawal. Human functioning and communication with others are ineffective, and individuals may be convinced that they have a life-threatening illness or fear that they are going crazy. They are losing control, or they feel like they're going crazy and losing control, and are emotionally weak. Prolonged panic anxiety can actually lead to physical and emotional exhaustion and can be life-threatening. Behavioral adaptation responses to anxiety. So at the mid-level, individuals employ various coping mechanisms to deal with stress. A few of these include eating, drinking, and sleeping. So individuals adapt at a mild level anxiety. Coping mechanisms such as the sleeping, drinking, cursing, finger tapping are pretty common at this level. At the mild to moderate level, the strength of the ego is actually tested. So the ego defense mechanisms are more common in mild to moderate anxiety. These include denial, isolation, and projection, among others. I want you guys to stop and think about within the last week, any times maybe that you have observed ego defense mechanisms being used, and then kind of identify maybe what caused them or what was going on. All right, let's check your understanding again. A client hates her mother because of childhood neglect. The nurse determines which client statement represents the use of defense mechanisms of reaction formation. A, I don't like to talk about my relationships with my mother. B, my mother hates me. C, I have a very wonderful mother whom I love very much. Or D. My mother always loved my sister more than she loved me. So the correct answer here was C. The client hides her negative, unacceptable feelings by the exaggerated expression of positive feelings. This is an example of defense mechanism of reaction formation. All right, moderate to severe levels. So unresolved moderate to severe anxiety can contribute to physiological disorders, including cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, neoplastic, neurological, and pulmonary conditions. Extended periods of repressed severe anxiety can lead to psychoneurotic episodes such as anxiety disorders, somatic symptom disorders, or dissociative disorders. Common characteristics of individuals with neurosenses include that they are aware that they are experiencing distress, they are aware that their behaviors are maladaptive, they are unaware of any possible psychological causes of the distress, they feel helpless to change their situation, and they experience no loss of contact with reality. Panic level of anxiety. So unresolved panic anxiety can result in psychosis, which is a significant thought disturbance in which reality testing is impaired. Individuals may experience delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, or catatonic behavior. Examples of psychotic responses to anxiety include the schizophrenic, schizoaffective, and delusional disorders. All right, grief. The loss of anything of value to an individual can trigger the grief response. So Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief response are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So in denial, the stage of disbelief in which the reality of the loss is not acknowledged. Then anger, the stage of envy and resentment. Bargaining, stage of making promises to reverse or postpone the loss. Depression, stage of desperation and disengagement. And then acceptance is the final stage of resignation. Anticipatory grief loss is anticipated, and people can re-experience the grieving behaviors once the loss occurs. The resolution of the grief process, which may take anywhere from weeks to years, individuals must be allowed to progress at their own pace. The length of the grieving process can be influenced by several factors, such as other recent losses and anticipation of the loss, and the process can last from a few weeks to a few years again. The experience of guilt for having had a love-hate relationship with the lost entity, and guilt often lengthens the grieving process. Anticipatory grieving is thought to shorten the grief response when the loss actually occurs, and the length of the grief response is often extended when an individual has experienced a number of recent losses and when he or she is unable to complete one grieving process before another one begins. Resolution of grief response is thought to occur when an individual can look back on the relationship with the lost entity and accept both the pleasures and the disappointments of the association. So there can be indications that the mourning process is resolved, and these include the regaining of sense of organization, the pursuit of new interests and relationships, and the replacement of preoccupation with energy and resolve. There are some potential maladaptive grief responses. These can occur when an individual cannot progress through those stages that we talked about of grief to achieve resolution. Some examples and some things can include prolonged responses characterized with intense preoccupation with the lost entity, delayed or inhibited response in which the individual becomes stuck in the denial stage of the grieving process, or distorted responses in which the individual becomes stuck in anger stage of the process. So not moving through those stages will actually do more harm than good. All right, last one for checking your response. A widow of a 23-year-old has not removed any of her husband's possessions, including the slippers beside their bed. Which pathological grief response is being exhibited by this client? A, inhibited grief response. B, prolonged grief response. C, delayed grief response. Or D, distorted grief response. All right, the correct answer here is B. The prolonged grief response is characterized by intense preoccupation with the memories of lost persons years after the loss has occurred. This is how the client has responded to her husband's death. All right, so that is it for this PowerPoint.